The City Behind the Wall, tonight and. Have you ever wondered why so many ancient wars seem to end at a wall? Why the story narrows again and again to a gate, a rampart, a ring of stone or mud brick holding its breath? In the ancient world, power did not always live on open plains. Often it gathered itself into a single place and dared the horizon to come and take it. Dawn comes slowly over the riverlands. A thin mist clings to reeds and low banks, turning the water into a strip of pale metal. Somewhere beyond the fields, a city rises from the flat earth like a man-made hill, its walls the color of dried clay, its towers catching the first light and holding it. Inside those walls, the day is already beginning. You can hear it before you see it. The distant bray of donkeys, the bark of a foreman calling laborers to a canal, the low chant of a temple hymn carried on cool air. Smoke curls from hearths. A potter's wheel starts to spin. A gate creaks open, and a few early figures pass beneath its shadow guards with spears, farmers with baskets, a scribe wrapped in linen holding his reed stylus like a small wand of authority. The city is not merely a cluster of houses. It is an idea made physical. It is grain stored in sealed rooms, measured and recorded. It is law spoken, written, enforced. It is the temple's glittering offerings, the king's sealed storerooms, the workshops where bronze takes shape, the courtyards where disputes are judged. It is also fear distilled into architecture. The wall is a line drawn between the known and the unknown, the governed and the ungoverned, the protected and the exposed. And this quietly is what our story is really about. The moment human life becomes concentrated enough, valuable enough, vulnerable enough, that war must become a craft of taking cities. Siege warfare is not simply a set of machines and tactics. It is the shadow cast by civilization itself. When people began to build dense urban centers, when wealth archived sacred objects, rulers and markets gathered behind fortifications, warfare followed them there. To win a war, you no longer had to chase an army across fields. You had to break a city or make it yield. The first great trap: urban wealth, urban risk. In the earliest river valleys, a strange bargain took hold. Water meant life, but it also meant dependence. To farm in dry lands, you had to dig canals, build embankments, manage seasonal floods. Irrigation demanded coordination, many hands, many days. Rules, schedules, leadership. Over time, that coordination hardened into institutions. A village became a town became a city became a rival to its neighbors, each one watching the river like a lifeline and a boundary. In places like southern Mesopotamia, where city-states rose from the alluvial plain, wealth was not hidden in scattered farms alone. It pooled in central spaces, temple granaries, communal storehouses, marketplaces, near gates, workshops, where craft specialists shaped pottery, textiles, and metal tools. The city became a reservoir of food, labor, knowledge, and legitimacy. But reservoirs invite siege. A concentrated city could feed itself in lean seasons if it controlled enough surrounding fields and if its canals still flowed. It could shelter people behind walls. It could store tribute and surplus. Yet that very concentration created a single decisive target. A rival did not have to destroy every farmstead in the countryside. It could aim for the nerve center, capture the city, and the surrounding district often followed like a limb losing its command. This is one of the most important reasons siege warfare became so frequent. Cities offered strategic shortcuts. In a world without modern communications, taking the capital, taking the temple precinct, the palace, the archive could collapse a political order quickly. It was not just territory that mattered. It was the seat of authority. And authority in ancient societies was not abstract. It was visible. It stood in stone and brick. Walls as politics a city's face to the world. Imagine approaching such a city from the open land. The fields are low and green, stitched by irrigation channels. Beyond them, the wall rises. Even a modest wall changes the psychology of space. It tells outsiders where power begins. It tells residents where safety is supposed to be. It promises protection against raiders, against rival city-states, against the sudden violence that can unravel a harvest. But walls were not built only for defense. They were built for identity. A wall could be a declaration we are organized, we are wealthy, we can command labor. The very act of constructing fortifications required coordination and surplus. Mud-brick walls needed constant repair. They drank labor the way canals drank water. Stone walls demanded quarrying transport skilled masons. Towers required planning watch schedules, garrisoning. Gates required carpentry, metal fittings, locks, and guards. So a wall said something to everyone who saw it, friend and enemy alike. It said, "We are not a village you can plunder in an afternoon. We are a city. If you want what we have, you will have to pay for it in time, blood, and resources." And thus the wall becomes a stage, a boundary where diplomacy, intimidation, and warfare meet. The gate is a mouth that can speak, welcoming traders one day, refusing emissaries the next, swallowing prisoners, releasing envoys with sealed messages. When we talk about siege warfare, we often picture machines, rams, towers, catapults. But those tools came later, and even then, they were only part of the story. At its heart, a siege is a contest of systems logistics against endurance organization, against morale, time against hunger. The oldest siege engine, time. Long before specialized siege machines, the most reliable way to take a city was to surround it and wait. This is not as simple as it sounds. To starve a city, an attacker must feed an army. To isolate walls, an attacker must control roads, fields, and water access. The besieging force becomes a second, temporary city built of tents, earthworks, and discipline. It must endure heat, dust, disease, and the temptation to drift away for plunder. It must stay long enough for the defender's stored grain to shrink into scarcity. In ancient siege warfare, time was not neutral. It was a weapon, one that punished whoever's system failed first. Inside the walls, life tightened. Food was rationed. Wells became precious. Livestock might be slaughtered early or hidden away. Families moved closer to the city center, away from vulnerable outer districts. The gates closed, and the city's rhythm changed. Markets quieted. The temple's rituals grew more urgent. The leaders, kings, elders, priests had to keep hope alive because hope was part of the city's defense. And hope is fragile when you can hear the enemy outside at night, the scrape of shovels, digging trenches, the thud of stakes hammered into the earth, the low murmur of campfires and men who are not going home until something breaks. Outside the walls, the attackers face their own slow erosion. They had to hold discipline. They had to prevent sorties, sudden rushes from the gates, meant to burn siege works or gather supplies. They had to defend themselves from relief armies, rivals, or allies who might arrive to break the encirclement. A siege, then, is a drama with two audiences, those watching from behind battlements and those staring up at them from below. Both sides are trapped in a landscape of waiting. Why ancient civilization produced siege warfare. If we step back, the pattern becomes clearer. Siege warfare became frequent, not because ancient people were uniquely cruel or uniquely obsessed with walls, but because the structure of their world made sieges logical, often inevitable. 1. Urbanization concentrated value. People, grain craftsmen, temples, archives, and rulers were gathered into fortified nodes. Those nodes were attractive targets. 2. Political authority was centralized in cities. Defeat in the countryside could be recovered from. The fall of the city, especially the capital, often ended the war. 3. Agriculture tied power to land and water systems. Canals, irrigation works, and storage facilities were vulnerable. Control over them could be won by taking the city that organized them. 4. Fortifications raised the cost of direct battle. If defenders could refuse, open combat attackers were forced into prolonged operations, encirclement, cutting supplies, building ramps, undermining walls. 5. Large states could afford siege warfare. Sustained sieges required surplus food stores, administrative control engineers labor, and the ability to keep men in the field for months. This last point matters more than it first appears. Sieges reward wealth and bureaucracy. A small raiding band can burn fields and flee. It cannot sit patiently outside a fortified city through a season. Siege warfare, therefore, is both a symptom and an accelerator of state power. The more organized a kingdom becomes, the more effectively it can besiege, and the more it fears being besieged. So walls rise higher, moats deepen, gatehouses become more complex, and the cycle continues. Archaeology and the silent evidence of siege. We do not rely only on later texts to sense this. Archaeologists find the slow fingerprints of siege warfare, burned layers where a city's life abruptly ended, arrowheads embedded in collapsed brick, hastily repaired walls, tunnels and counter-tunnels, mass graves that suggest violence concentrated in a short time, shattered pottery in streets where people fled or fought. Sometimes they find ramp remains, packed earth slopes built by attackers to reach the top of walls. Sometimes they find city plans that tell a story of fear, walls, extended gates, narrowed defensive towers, added neighborhoods, reorganized around security. Even in the absence of grand inscriptions, the landscape remembers. A wall is not only a structure, it is an argument. It says the world is dangerous, but here we will endure. And when an enemy appears, the wall becomes a question. Will you endure? A quiet closing the gate as threshold. As the sun climbs, the city's shadow shortens. The gate stands like a throat of wood and bronze, its hinges dark with oil. On ordinary days it is a place of trade and conversation where caravans arrive and messengers depart. But in a time of war, the gate becomes the most watched object in the world, because every siege in the end is about thresholds. Will the defenders keep the threshold closed long enough for the enemy to tire? Will the attackers find a way to cross it by hunger, by betrayal, by engineering by force? Will the city's story continue or end in smoke and silence? In the next part, we will step closer to the oldest siegecraft of all, the slow mastery of deprivation. We will follow the logic that turned fields into battlefields and bread into ammunition, and we will see how hunger and thirst became for ancient armies the most dependable weapons they ever carried. Mudbrick empires and the arithmetic of hunger. Before the world learned to throw stones with machines, it learned something colder, that a city can be defeated without being touched. The oldest siege engine was not wood or bronze. It was time applied to the human body. Morning light breaks over a ring of tents and low earthworks. Outside the city's walls, still damp with night air, campfires cough thin smoke. The besiegers have settled into the patient labor of captivity, digging shallow trenches, setting watch posts, staking lines where no one may pass. Somewhere a donkey brays, and the sound travels oddly in the open space between army and wall, an empty corridor where arrows sometimes fly, and where silence is often more threatening than noise. Inside the gates, the city wakes to a different kind of day. There is no bustle at the market. The first thing people do is listening for the rhythm of life beyond the wall. Are the enemies still there? Have they moved? Has a relief force arrived? The wall itself seems to breathe, exhaling the stale warmth of crowded courtyards and narrow lanes. In a corner near the temple precinct, a line forms at a well, containers in hand. Water sloshes and clinks. A mother hushes a child too loudly excited, as if sound might travel through brick. And quietly, almost without announcement, the siege becomes what it always becomes, an accounting. This part is really about endurance, not the romantic endurance of songs, but the measured endurance of granaries, cisterns, morale, and governance. In the ancient world where walls could resist sudden violence, rulers discovered a brutal truth. If you could control food and water, you could control a city's fate. Many sieges were not won by storming battlements, but by turning the landscape around a city into a closed fist. The landscape as a weapon. Ancient cities did not float above their countryside. They were stitched to it. Fields lay outside the walls, wheat and barley orchards grazing land. Irrigation canals ran like veins. Roads brought salt timber metal and fish, brought merchants and pilgrims, brought news. A city's walls could protect what was inside, but they could not protect the harvest as it stood in the soil. That vulnerability was the first lever of blockade warfare. An attacker who could seize the surrounding fields, burn crops at the right season, or capture the herds could weaken a city before a single stone was thrown. The defenders might drive animals inside the walls, but space was limited. Fodder ran out. Disease spread among penned livestock. If siege began after harvest, the city might hold longer. If it began before harvest, the city's future was strangled in advance. So siege warfare became seasonal, strategic, and deeply informed by agricultural calendars. You did not merely attack a city, you attacked its relationship with time. And then there was water. In many early settlements, water sources were near, but not always secure. Some cities had wells and cisterns. Others depended on rivers, springs, channels, or aqueduct-like systems that could be cut, diverted, or poisoned. To control water was to control the pace of collapse, because hunger can be endured longer than thirst. When water fails, fear moves through a city like smoke, quickly, invisibly, and into every room. The besiegers labor building a second city. It is easy to imagine besiegers as a mass of warriors waiting for glory, but the reality was often closer to construction work. A prolonged siege required encampments, supply routes, storage, sanitation, and constant vigilance. It demanded timber for palisades and siege ramps later on, clay for ovens, fodder for animals, tools for digging. The besieging army became a temporary city, one that had to survive disease, heat, dust storms, winter rains, and the slow grind of boredom. This is why siege warfare favored organized states. A raiding band could sweep in and out, but it could not hold a ring around walls for weeks and months. Only polities with administrative capacity, able to gather provisions, rotate troops, levy labor, and keep discipline, could reliably execute blockade strategy. Even in early periods, the ability to sustain a siege often reflected a society's deeper strengths: taxation, logistics authority, and social cohesion. A siege was therefore a display of power in the fullest sense, not simply power to fight, but power to feed. The defenders' burden rationing order and morale. Inside the walls, the siege transformed everyday life into a series of constrained choices. At first, leaders try to project calm. Rations are announced not as desperation, but as prudence to ensure fairness, to preserve the city's strength. Grain is counted. Bread portions shrink subtly. Markets shift from abundance to substitution barley, where wheat once was dried goods, where fresh once was watered beer, thin porridge. But the deeper strain is psychological. Cities are crowded even in peace. In siege, they become compressed families, doubling up strangers, sharing courtyards, refugees from outlying farms, bringing stories of burned fields and stolen animals. Space tightens. Tempers shorten. Rumors grow strong legs. Leaders, kings, councils, temple. Authorities must keep the population believing in an outcome that has not yet arrived. They do this through ritual proclamation and punishment. Temples become emotional engines, turning fear into structured pleading hymns, offerings, vows, processions along walls. The divine world is asked to become an ally because humans alone may not be enough. And yet, even piety has limits when bellies ache. This is one of the harsh truths of siege warfare. Walls protect bodies from arrows, but they do not protect minds from despair. Morale is a resource, and it can be spent faster than grain if leadership fails. Hunger as politics. In siege conditions, food is never merely food. It becomes politics in its most intimate form. Who receives rations? First, soldiers, children, priests, elites. Who controls distribution? Who guards the granaries? The answers reveal the city's hierarchy and its cracks. If people believe the system is fair, they endure longer. If they suspect hoarding corruption or favoritism, endurance collapses inward into riots, betrayal, and factional struggle. This is why ancient rulers invested so heavily in public legitimacy. In calm years, legitimacy looks like festivals, building projects, justice at the gate. In siege years, legitimacy becomes survival itself, the belief that the rulers can still manage the city's life. And the besieger knows this. A blockade is not only a physical ring. It is a psychological pressure designed to make the defenders ask again and again, is surrender cheaper than hope? Sometimes attackers offered terms: early safe passage, preservation of a temple, mercy for those who opened a gate. Sometimes they used terror, parading prisoners, displaying captured banners, letting stories of punishment travel like disease. Even without siege engines, words and spectacle were part of the toolkit, because the goal was not simply to starve the city. The goal was to break agreement inside it. The silent arts: cutting, draining, waiting. When we imagine ancient siege warfare, we often jump forward to dramatic assaults. But blockade warfare was its own craft, with techniques refined across generations. Encirclement and patrols preventing movement, in and out catching messengers, cutting trade. Control of roads and river crossings, turning geography into a trap. Seizing outworks and suburbs, stripping the city of space and supplies. Targeting irrigation and canals, starving fields and compromising water. Harassment and sorties management, punishing defenders who tried to gather food or burn siege works. Information control, bribing insiders, capturing couriers, spreading rumors, negotiating with factions. These are not glamorous tactics. They are quiet, methodical, and devastating. They turn war into a long pressure, like a stone placed on a chest. And because they demanded time, they also demanded patience, a quality that ancient states cultivated through discipline, fear of punishment, and reward. The besieging army had to believe that waiting was victory. what the ground remembers. Even when written records are scarce or biased, archaeology can whisper the contours of blockade. A city shows signs of hasty storage, extra pits, sealed rooms. It shows crowded living layers. It shows trauma in bones, malnutrition stress markers, sudden death clustered in time. It shows repair work on walls, added revetments, thickened gates, blocked passages suggesting a society preparing for siege as a normal condition of existence. And sometimes it shows the abrupt end-burned destruction layers, broken defenses, empty streets where a population vanished. Not every burned layer is a siege, and not every siege ends in fire, but across the ancient world, the pattern repeats often enough to be unmistakable. The siege is not an exception. It is a recurring climate. The gentle edge of the next era. As days pass, the corridor between army and wall becomes familiar. Dust settles into footprints. A rhythm forms, watchmen's, ration calls, hymns at dawn, quiet, sobbing at night. The city and the besiegers begin to mirror one another, two communities facing each other across a line neither can ignore. And yet blockade has limits. Walls do not always yield to hunger alone. Sometimes relief armies arrive. Sometimes defenders break out. Sometimes politics shifts and the ring dissolves. Over time, as fortifications improved and states grew larger, attackers sought more decisive methods, ways to speed the outcome, to physically breach what patience could not always conquer. In the next part, we will follow the people who made that shift possible, the planners and builders of war, the engineers, sappers, carpenters, metallurgists, and organizers who turned siege warfare from waiting into craft. The engineers of the gods. There is a moment in every long siege when waiting ceases to be enough. The fields lie bare. The city still stands. The walls have not cracked. The defenders still answer calls from the battlements, still raise their banners at dawn. And so in the half-light before morning, new sounds join the quiet rhythm of blockade, measured deliberate sounds, the scrape of shovels against earth, the knock of wooden mallets, the low murmur of men counting paces, aligning lines, arguing angles. This is the moment when siege warfare becomes something more than hunger. This is the moment when knowledge steps forward. The story of this part is about intellect turned into pressure, about how ancient societies learned that walls could be studied, measured, undermined, and overcome not only by force, but by planning. Siege warfare at its most effective was never just brutality. It was applied understanding of materials, of geometry, of psychology, of labor. The city was no longer only starved, it was solved. The quiet specialists. In the earliest armies, warriors fought. In mature siege armies, specialists worked. They were not always celebrated in songs, but they were indispensable. Men, and sometimes entire labor corps, trained to cut timber, dig earth-shape stone, fit bronze, and move heavy loads in coordination. Some knew how walls were built because they had built them. Some understood soil where it was soft enough to tunnel, where it would collapse. Others read the wall itself like a text, its seams, its repairs, its weak corners where earlier floods or earthquakes had left subtle scars. These people did not shout battle cries. They measured. They counted paces from wall to camp. They watched shadows to judge height. They tested soil moisture with bare hands. They listened sometimes literally to the ground, pressing ears to earth to detect counter-tunnels. Siege warfare produced a new kind of authority, the authority of the engineer, whose quiet judgment could determine whether hundreds lived or died. And because knowledge was often sacred in the ancient world, These specialists were frequently wrapped in ritual significance. Their work began with omen sacrifices or prayers, not because they doubted their craft, but because uncertainty was everywhere. A misjudged tunnel could collapse and bury its diggers. A misaligned ramp could become a death trap under missile fire. Appeasing the unseen was part of risk management. Thus, siege engineers stood at a strange intersection between calculation and faith. Walls as systems, not objects. To an untrained eye, a wall is a barrier. To a siege engineer, it is a system. Walls have foundations. They rest on soil that shifts with water and season. They are thick in some places, thin in others. They are repaired over generations, often with mismatched materials. They are pierced by gates, drains, posterns, necessary weaknesses disguised as features. Towers may project outward, creating blind spots below them. Ditches may protect the base, but also channel rainwater into predictable paths. Understanding this turned the siege from a gamble into a process. Rather than attack everywhere, engineers sought specific points, corners where two walls met slopes, where defenders had difficulty aiming, downward areas where earthworks could be raised without collapse. They learned to use the city's own design against it. This was not a sudden revolution. It emerged slowly as cities grew larger and walls more complex. Each failed assault taught lessons. Each successful breach became a model. Over generations, this accumulated experience hardened into tradition. Siege warfare began to produce its own body of inherited knowledge passed through practice rather than books. Labor as a weapon. One of the most underestimated aspects of ancient siege warfare is sheer labor. To dig a ramp, you needed thousands of baskets of earth. To build a tower, you needed timber carpentry, transport, and time. To tunnel, you needed coordinated shifts, ventilation bracing, and spoil removal. None of this happened quickly or invisibly. Siege work unfolded in full view of the city day after day, a reminder that the attackers were not leaving. This visibility was itself a form of pressure. From the walls, defenders watched earthworks rise like slow threats. They saw frames take shape, heard the creak of beams, smelled fresh-cut wood. Every basket of soil carried forward was a message. We are investing in your fall. In response, defenders adapted. They extended walls, dug counter-ditches, dropped stones, and fire-dug counter-tunnels. The siege became a dialogue of construction and destruction, each side reacting to the other's ingenuity. And all of it depended on organization. A state that could mobilize labor, whether free citizens, conscripts, or captives, held an enormous advantage. Siege warfare magnified inequalities between societies. Those with surplus manpower, centralized authority, and the ability to compel work could reshape the battlefield itself. Those without it were forced back into endurance alone. Knowledge, risk, and authority. Engineering in siege warfare was not safe. It required leaders willing to trust expertise. This mattered more than it seems. In many ancient societies, authority rested on lineage, charisma, or divine favor. Siegecraft challenged that. It placed survival in the hands of people whose power came from competence. A king could order a tunnel dug, but only an experienced digger knew how to keep it from collapsing. A general could demand speed, but only a planner knew when speed would kill more attackers than defenders. Successful siege warfare therefore nudged political culture toward functional hierarchy. Leaders who listened to specialists lasted longer. Leaders who ignored them often learned too late that walls punish arrogance. This tension appears again and again in ancient accounts. commanders overridden by practical men, disasters blamed on ignored advice, victories credited quietly to those whose names never entered royal inscriptions. The siege engineer becomes a symbol of something larger, the growing complexity of warfare in complex societies. The moral distance of technique. There is another shift here, subtle but profound. Starvation is impersonal, but it is slow. Assault is violent, but immediate. Engineering sits between them. It introduces distance, not physical distance, but moral distance. A wall collapses because of calculations, not rage. A tower falls because of undermining, not hatred. This does not make siege warfare humane. It makes it efficient. As techniques improved, destruction became less chaotic and more controlled. Cities could be taken intact, populations could be spared or selectively punished. Temples could be preserved, archives could be seized. Siege warfare became not only a way to destroy cities, but a way to inherit them. That mattered enormously to expanding states. If the goal was governance, not annihilation, then controlled breaching was preferable to indiscriminate slaughter. Engineering enabled conquest that could be absorbed. Archaeology, and the shape of thought modern archaeology, gives us glimpses of these invisible minds at work. We find tunnel traces beneath walls collapsed or intentionally filled. We find ramps composed of layered soils carefully packed. We find reused bricks where walls were hastily reinforced. We find scorch marks at consistent heights where towers once stood. We find tools, picks, wedges, timber supports abandoned when a siege ended suddenly either in victory or retreat. These traces tell us that ancient warfare was not merely brave or brutal, it was thoughtful. It required planning across weeks and months. It demanded foresight. It punished improvisation without understanding. In this sense, siege warfare mirrors the societies that practiced it, layered, cumulative, dependent on coordination. The road forward. As the siege engineer's role expanded, so did the ambition of attackers. If walls could be studied, they could be designed against. If defenders built higher, attackers built taller. If stone replaced mud-brick, tools evolved. Each innovation on one side provoked a response on the other. The wall and the engine began to co-evolve, locked in a slow arms race that would define ancient warfare for centuries. In the next part, we will step closer to the machines themselves, not as sudden inventions, but as natural extensions of the knowledge we have just followed. We will watch wood and metal become leverage, flame become strategy, and gravity become an ally. Ram's fire and the first siege machines. There is a particular sound that marks a new phase in war. It is not the shout of soldiers or the whistle of arrows. It is a deeper, more rhythmic noise, a heavy, deliberate impact that repeats patient and inexorable. From behind the wall it arrives as a dull thunder, vibrating through brick and bone alike. From outside, it is the sound of effort, organized into purpose. The wall is being struck. This part is about force given shape, about the moment when human hands learn to extend their strength through tools, and siege warfare crossed a threshold. No longer content to wait or to dig alone, ancient armies began to bring the wall itself into direct confrontation with motion, fire, and weight. Siege machines did not appear fully formed. They emerged from craft traditions, from trial and failure, from the growing realization that architecture could be answered by engineering. The logic of impact walls are strong because they are still. They rely on mass thickness and balance. To defeat them, attackers needed to introduce controlled movement force focused at specific points, repeated again and again until structure gave way. The simplest answer was also the oldest, the battering ram. At its most basic, a ram was nothing more than a heavy beam driven forward by human muscle. But even this simplicity concealed careful thought. The beam had to be hard enough to resist splintering, often capped with metal or hardened wood. It had to be aimed low where walls were weakest, or at gates whose very function made them vulnerable. It had to be protected because a ram in use drew attention like a wound draws flies. So shelters were built around it, frames, roofs, hides, soaked in water to resist fire. Slowly, the ram became not just a log, but a system carriers, covers, crews, trained to swing in rhythm, overseers, watching for cracks. To the defenders above the ram was terrifying precisely because it was mechanical. It did not tire in the way a single warrior did. If the crew rotated, the blows could continue for hours. Each strike was a question asked of the wall. How long can you endure fire? The ambivalent ally. Alongside impact came flame. Fire was both ancient and unpredictable, a tool that promised speed but threatened chaos. Used carefully, it could weaken gates, burn siege towers built by defenders, smoke out parapets, and create panic. Used recklessly, it could turn on the attackers themselves, igniting wooden machines, consuming supply stores, or spreading beyond control. This dual nature made fire a strategic choice rather than a default tactic. Defenders often prepared for it, storing water sand and hides, coating vulnerable wood with clay or metal. Attackers learned to time fire with wind and assault, to use it as distraction as much as destruction. In some cases, flaming materials were thrown not to burn walls which stone resisted, but to force defenders back from parapets, opening moments of opportunity. Fire also carried symbolic weight. To burn a gate or tower was to threaten not just the city's defenses, but its identity. Gates were ceremonial spaces as much as military ones, places of law exchange and ritual. To see them aflame was to see order itself endangered, ladders, hooks, and the geometry of height. Not all siege machines were massive. Some were simple, portable, and brutally direct. Ladders allowed attackers to meet defenders face to face on the wall, turning vertical distance into a narrow bridge of fear. Hooks could pull away parapets or shields. Grappling devices could catch on crenellations, allowing men to climb where arrows rained down. These tools required courage, but they also required calculation. A ladder too short was useless, too long, and it became unstable. The angle mattered, the placement mattered, the coordination mattered. Assaults with ladders were often feints intended to draw defenders to one section, while engineers worked elsewhere. What mattered was not the ladder itself, but how it forced the defenders to divide attention. Siege warfare increasingly became about overloading response-making defenders choose between multiple threats with limited resources. The rise of the siege tower. If the wall was tall, the answer was height. Siege towers were among the most ambitious machines of the ancient world. Built of timber and packed earth mounted on wheels or rollers, they were moving buildings designed to rise to the level of the battlements and beyond. From their platforms, archers could fire downward, and assault teams could cross directly onto the wall. Building a tower was a declaration of intent. It required vast quantities of wood-skilled carpenters, iron fittings, hides for fireproofing, and weeks of labor. It could not be hidden. As it rose in the besiegers' camp, it dominated the horizon, a slow-growing promise of confrontation. Defenders responded with ingenuity, digging ditches to trap wheels, hurling firebrands, building counter-towers, reinforcing walls where towers approached. The presence of a siege tower transformed the battle from static, waiting into a tense choreography of advance and countermeasure. More than any other machine, the siege tower embodied the shift from siege as endurance to siege as engineering spectacle. It made visible the attackers' investment, their refusal to leave their confidence that the wall could be matched height for height. Machines as messages. It is important to understand that siege machines were not only tools, they were messages. To the defenders, they said, "We are committed, we have resources, we have time. Your wall is not enough." To allies watching from afar, they said, "This city will fall. Choose your loyalties carefully." To the attackers themselves, they provided focus and morale. Building and operating machines gave purpose to waiting. It turned the siege into a shared project, binding the army together through labor and anticipation. In this sense, siege machines reshaped the emotional landscape of war. They made the outcome feel inevitable even before it occurred. Archaeology and the scars of assault. Although wood decays, the ground remembers. Archaeologists find layers of ash near gate stones cracked by repeated impact, unusual concentrations of metal fittings, and abrupt changes in wall construction where repairs followed assault. They find defensive modifications, thickened gatehouses, angled approaches flanking towers, responses to known machines. Sometimes they find abandoned siege works, ramps begun, but never finished, towers dismantled. When a siege ended, suddenly tools left where men fled. These incomplete projects tell stories of war interrupted by politics, weather, or relief armies. Siege warfare was never guaranteed success. It was a wager. Why machines changed everything. The introduction of siege machines did not eliminate starvation or waiting. It compressed time. Machines offered alternatives to indefinite blockade. They allowed attackers to apply pressure selectively to threaten decisive moments rather than endless attrition. They also raised the stakes. Once machines appeared, defenders knew the siege had entered a more dangerous phase. Negotiations might intensify, desperation might rise. Over time, this shift encouraged further innovation on both sides. Walls grew thicker, angled, and more complex. Gatehouses became labyrinths. Towers multiplied. In response, machines became heavier, better protected, more specialized. An arms race had begun, slow, cumulative, and deeply tied to the resources of states. A quiet transition. As dusk falls, the ram rests beneath its shelter, its beam darkened by use. The tower stands unfinished ribs exposed against the sky. Smoke from small fires drifts upward, not in chaos, but in careful lines. On the wall, defenders watch, counting days, counting machines, counting how much longer their city can remain whole. Siege warfare is no longer just about hunger or patience. It has become a contest of design material and resolve, a dialogue between wall and machine. In the next part, we will enter a world where this dialogue reaches a grim clarity, an empire that made siege warfare its signature, its spectacle, and its warning to the world. Assyria. The siege becomes an empire's signature. There are moments in history when a method of war stops being merely useful and becomes a language. In the Near East of the early 1st millennium BCE, siege warfare did exactly that. It became a grammar of power, spoken in stone reliefs, carved into palace walls, and understood by cities long before the army itself appeared on the horizon. The morning sun rises over the Tigris, catching the edges of carved alabaster panels. In the cool shadows of a palace corridor, images unfold in sequence: walls, breached towers, aflame captives, led away in lines, kings towering larger than life. These are not private memories. They are messages arranged so that anyone who walks these halls will understand what Assyria does to cities that resist. This part is about systematization, about how siege warfare, refined by many cultures, was taken by Assyria and turned into an imperial instrument. Not improvised, not episodic, but planned, rehearsed, displayed. The Assyrian siege was not just a battle. It was a policy, an empire built to move and to stay. Assyria did not invent siege warfare, but it mastered something rarer, the ability to repeat it at scale. From its heartland in northern Mesopotamia, Assyria expanded across diverse landscapes, river valleys, hills, plains, and fortified cities that had learned their defensive lessons well. To rule such a world, Assyria needed more than courage. It needed predictability. When an Assyrian army arrived before a city, the outcome needed to be reliable. This reliability came from organization. Assyrian kings commanded standing forces, supported by administrators, scribes, supply networks, and engineers. Campaigns were planned months in advance. Timber, metal fittings, and food stores moved with the army. Siege equipment was not invented on the spot. It was expected, prepared, and deployed as a matter of course. The city was no longer an obstacle to be negotiated. It was a problem with known solutions. The siege as spectacle and warning. What sets Assyria apart is not only what it did, but how openly it showed it. Assyrian palace reliefs depict sieges in meticulous detail, battering rams with protective roofs, archers covering engineers, towers rising to match walls, defenders falling pleading or surrendering. These images were not subtle. They were didactic. They taught viewers, Assyrian elites, foreign envoys, subject rulers, what resistance meant. Siege warfare became theater. The king is always present in these scenes, calm-ordered, overseeing the machinery of conquest. Chaos is for the defenders. Order belongs to Assyria. The visual message is unmistakable. Walls will not save you. Your gods will not intervene. The outcome has already been decided. This mattered because Assyria ruled through anticipation as much as action. Many cities surrendered before a siege fully began precisely because they had seen or heard what happened to those who did not. Terror, calculation, and control. Assyrian brutality is often emphasized and not without reason. Punishments could be severe. Deportations were common. Public displays of punishment were intended to travel as stories faster than armies. But it is crucial to understand the logic beneath this terror. Assyria did not seek endless destruction. It sought compliance. A city that surrendered early might keep its walls, its leaders, its cults under tribute. A city that resisted might be destroyed, its population relocated, its identity erased. The siege, therefore, was a decision point offered to the defenders. Resist and face annihilation. Submit and be absorbed. This clarity reduced uncertainty. It also reduced the need for prolonged campaigns. Siege warfare in Assyrian hands became an efficient filter separating those who would rule themselves under Assyrian terms from those who would be removed. Engineering as routine archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Assyrian siegecraft was highly standardized. Battering rams with wheels and protective coverings appear repeatedly. Siege ramps, massive earthworks built under covering fire, allowed access to walls too strong for gates alone. Tunneling undermined foundations. Combined arms tactics, archers, slingers, engineers, and assault troops working in coordination became the norm. What makes this remarkable is not any single technique, but their integration. Assyrian armies did not rely on one method. They applied pressure everywhere at once: starvation, intimidation, engineering assault. This overwhelmed defenders' ability to adapt. A city might counter tunnels but not towers, resist rams but not fire, endure hunger but not fear. Siege warfare here is no longer linear. It is layered, cities as administrative nodes. Why invest so much in taking cities intact? Because for Assyria, cities were not trophies. They were infrastructure. A captured city became a tax center, a garrison, a supply depot, a node in a growing imperial network. Roads connected it to the heartland. Governors replaced kings. Scribes recorded output. Temples were often preserved not out of mercy, but pragmatism. Religion stabilized populations. Stability produced revenue. This is where siege warfare reveals its deepest connection to empire. To govern an urban world, you must first master urban conquest. Siegecraft was not merely destructive, it was foundational. The archaeology of Assyrian sites confirm the scale of this system. Excavations show cities with sudden destruction layers consistent with assault. Others show continuity under new administration, same streets, same houses, different rulers. Deportation records align with material shifts, new pottery styles, altered diets, population changes visible in burial practices. And in Assyrian capitals like Nineveh, the reliefs themselves are archaeological artifacts, primary sources that show how siege warfare was meant to be remembered, not as tragedy, as order restored through force. The wall reconsidered for defenders across the Near East Assyria forced a painful realization. Walls alone were no longer enough. Cities responded by thickening defenses, adding towers, improving gates, and forming alliances. Some invested in diplomacy, first fortification second. Others doubled down on resistance, hoping geography or distance would save them. But the balance had shifted. Siege warfare, once episodic and uncertain, had become a repeatable, imperial technology, and once that threshold was crossed, the ancient world would never entirely step back from it. A measured ending. As the Assyrian army moves on the wall, stands scarred, breached, or newly repurposed, the city's name may remain or vanish. In either case, the lesson lingers. Siege warfare is no longer simply a response to walls. It is a strategy for ruling an urban world. In the next part, we will widen the lens again away from one empire and toward the materials that made this transformation possible. Stone, iron, timber, and labor will take center stage as we explore how technology itself reshaped what cities could endure and what attackers could imagine. Stone iron and the science of breaking cities. There is a quiet moment after a city falls when dust still hangs in the air and the walls, once symbols of permanence, lie cracked and uneven. In that silence, one truth becomes unmistakable. Cities do not fall only because of courage or cruelty. They fall because materials fail. The story of this part is about matter and method, about how stone, iron, timber, and disciplined labor transformed siege warfare from an art of pressure into a science of inevitability. As ancient civilizations mastered new materials, they also learned something unsettling, that every wall, no matter how proud, contains within it the conditions of its own collapse. The weight of stone walls changed everything. Earlier, mud-brick fortifications were strong, but vulnerable to water fire and sustained impact. Stone promised durability. It resisted flames, weathered time, and absorbed blows without crumbling easily. Cities that could afford stone walls believed they had crossed a threshold into true security. But stone introduced new problems. It was heavy. It rested on foundations that could crack under uneven stress. It relied on precise fitting. Where joints were weak, force could concentrate. Stone walls often needed ramps or terraces to support their height features that attackers could exploit. Siege warfare adapted accordingly. Engineers learned that stone was less forgiving than mudbrick when undermined. Remove the earth beneath and gravity would do the rest. Stone, once dislodged, became a weapon against its own defenders, falling inward, crushing streets and structures behind the wall. Thus, stone did not end sieges. It reshaped them. Iron and the reach of force iron did not make soldiers braver. It made them more capable. Iron tools, picks, chisels, axes, wedges lasted longer and cut deeper than bronze. They allowed faster excavation, more reliable timber framing, and more precise shaping of siege equipment. Iron fittings strengthened rams, reinforced towers, and bound wooden structures into cohesive machines. This mattered because siege warfare was cumulative. A tool that did not break after hours of work multiplied effort. Iron extended endurance. It also democratized violence. Iron was more widely available than bronze, which depended on distant trade networks. As iron spread, more states could field capable engineers and siege crews. The knowledge of how to break walls was no longer restricted to a narrow elite. Walls rose higher, tools grew sharper, the cycle tightened. Timber, the hidden giant stone, draws the eye. Iron draws attention, but timber carried siege warfare on its back. Without wood there were no rams, no towers, no scaffolds, no protective roofs, no ramps reinforced against collapse. Forests became strategic assets. Campaigns followed timber routes as carefully as rivers. Timber also decayed, burned, warped, and failed, forcing constant maintenance. Siegecraft required carpenters who understood grain moisture and load. A poorly chosen beam could doom an entire assault. Thus, siege warfare deepened the connection between environment and empire. States that could manage forests sustainably or seize them violently held an advantage. Cities surrounded by barren land found themselves at a disadvantage not only in defense, but in the enemy's ability to bring machines against them. Geometry enters the battlefield. As materials improved, thinking became more precise. Angles mattered. The slope of a ramp determined whether wheels could turn. The arc of a thrown stone depended on tension and distance. The thickness of a wall determined how long it could withstand repeated blows. Siege warfare encouraged practical mathematics long before formal theory. Builders and engineers learned through experience, trial, failure, and adaptation. Over time, this produced conventions, standard ramp inclines, preferred gate angles, typical tower heights. This was not abstract knowledge. It was survival knowledge. Walls were redesigned with sloped faces to deflect impact. Towers were spaced to cover blind zones. Ditches were deepened not just to block approach, but to destabilize machines. In response, attackers refined countermeasures. The city became a puzzle. The siege became its solution. Labor, discipline, and time. None of this mattered without labor. Stone had to be quarried. Iron had to be mined and worked. Timber had to be cut, hauled, and shaped. Earth had to be moved, often by hand basket by basket. Siege warfare exposed the true strength of states, their ability to command time. An army that could keep men working day after day under fire and fatigue possessed more than courage. It possessed discipline, authority, and the ability to punish or reward. Siegecraft was less about moments of heroism and more about weeks of obedience. This is why siege warfare so often mirrored political structure. Highly centralized states with rigid hierarchies excelled at it. Looser coalitions struggled. Walls could be broken by force, but only if the society behind that force could hold itself together. The defenders, counter-science defenders, did not stand still. They thickened walls, layered materials, filled cores with rubble to absorb shock. They built angled gates to disrupt rams. They added projecting towers to create overlapping fields of fire. They experimented with counter-tunnels, listening pits, and internal buttressing. Defense became science as well. But defense always lagged behind offense, not in creativity, but in initiative. The attacker chose the moment, the place, and the method. The defender reacted. This asymmetry ensured that siege warfare remained dynamic, a continual conversation between destruction and preservation. Why this changed the ancient world? By mastering materials and methods, ancient societies transformed the nature of war. Sieges became longer but more predictable. Outcomes could be anticipated. Diplomacy adjusted accordingly. Cities calculated whether resistance was worth the cost. Empires calculated whether investment in siege was cheaper than perpetual rebellion. In this way, siege warfare helped shape ancient geopolitics. It favored large states. It punished fragmentation. It rewarded planning over impulse. And it reshaped architecture itself. Cities were no longer just places to live and worship. They were machines designed to resist other machines. A quiet descent. As night falls over a besieged city, the sound of tools does not stop. Somewhere iron strikes stone in a steady rhythm. Timber creaks under load. Earth shifts. The wall still stands, but it no longer feels eternal. In the next part, we will follow siege warfare beyond a single imperial tradition into the crossroads of Egypt, the Levant, and the eastern Mediterranean regions, where faith, trade, and fortification intertwined, and where the siege became not only a military act, but a struggle over sacred and commercial worlds. Fortresses of faith and trade. Egypt, the Levant, and the eastern Mediterranean. At dawn along the coast, the sea is calm enough to look like stone. Ships lie at anchor beyond a city's walls, their hulls dark against the pale water. On the landward side, the gates are shut. Between harbor and hinterland, the city holds its breath, caught between God's merchants and armies. This part is about cities that mattered too much to be erased. In the eastern Mediterranean world, siege warfare unfolded amid temples, ports, caravans, and pilgrimage routes. Here cities were not merely administrative nodes or military prizes. They were sacred spaces and commercial engines stitched into networks that stretched far beyond their walls. To besiege such a city was to threaten not just a ruler, but a web of beliefs, treaties, and trade that bound entire regions together. Rivers, gods, and the calculus of restraint. In the riverlands of Egypt, siege warfare followed a different rhythm. Egyptian power rested less on a landscape of rival city-states and more on the long spine of the Nile. Cities were important, but the river itself was the empire's artery. Grain moved by boat. Troops marched along predictable routes. Control of fortresses at choke points mattered more than the reduction of every walled town. As a result, sieges in Egypt were often selective. Fortresses guarded borders, canals, and approaches. They were designed to delay signal and control movement. When besieged, they were usually part of a larger strategic picture, intended to be isolated, starved, or bypassed, rather than spectacularly destroyed. Temples and ritual spaces carried immense legitimacy. To raise them was to invite cosmic disorder, not just rebellion. This did not make siege warfare gentle. It made it measured. The goal was continuity of harvest's cults and the Nile's rhythm. Cities were pressured into submission so they could continue to function once the banners changed. The Levant, where every city was a crossroads move north and east into the Levant, and the picture shifts dramatically. Here, geography compressed worlds together. Narrow coastal plains, inland hills, and desert edges created corridors of movement and friction. Cities controlled passes, ports and caravan routes. Many were old, layered with shrines, markets, and memories of past conquests. Their walls were thick, not only with stone, but with meaning. In this environment, siege warfare was frequent and charged. To besiege a Levantine city was to interrupt trade, offend patron gods, and threaten alliances. It was also to send a signal far beyond the immediate battlefield. Merchants watched closely. Neighboring rulers calculated risk. Priests interpreted omens. Cities like Jerusalem illustrate this tension. Fortified, elevated, and bound to powerful religious identity, such cities were never just targets. They were tests of endurance, of legitimacy, of divine favor. A siege here was as much a spiritual trial as a military one. Defenders drew strength from ritual and story. Attackers weighed the cost of sacrilege against strategic necessity. Outcomes reverberated across generations, preserved in texts, traditions, and ruins. Ports under pressure. The siege meets the sea along the coast. Siege warfare acquired a new dimension. Port cities were lifelines of exchange. Metals, timber, grain, luxury goods, and ideas moved through their harbors. Walls faced not only landward threats, but the open water. To besiege such a city required coordination across environments. The most famous example is Tyre. Perched partly offshore, Tyre challenged traditional siege logic. Its walls rose from the sea itself, mocking land-based engines. To take it required patience, innovation, and eventually control of the water as well as the land. Such sieges demonstrated that commerce could be both shield and vulnerability. As long as ships could enter the harbor, starvation was delayed. Once maritime access was cut, the city's strength became its isolation. Port sieges taught ancient commanders a crucial lesson. Walls are not only vertical, supply lines run in every direction. The sea could save a city or doom it. Temples, treaties, and the ethics of taking cities. Across the eastern Mediterranean, temples stood near gates and atop hills, their visibility intentional. They were meant to be seen by travelers, merchants, and enemies alike. They declared protection. They demanded respect. This complicated siege warfare. An attacker who damaged a major sanctuary risked more than local anger. He risked trade boycotts, diplomatic backlash, and reputational harm. Conversely, a conqueror who preserved temples could claim legitimacy, continuity, even divine approval. Thus many sieges ended, not with destruction, but with negotiation. Cities opened gates in exchange for guarantees, protection of cults, preservation of markets, continuity of local elites. Siege warfare became a pressure tactic to reshape political relationships without annihilating the city's role in the wider world. This is why we so often find ancient cities that were besieged repeatedly, yet rebuilt and reused rather than erased. Their value was too great to waste. Archaeology at the crossroads excavations in the region reveal this layered reality. Walls show repairs after multiple sieges. Temples are rebuilt atop older foundations. Harbors are expanded, fortified, modified. Destruction layers exist, but so do continuity layers where occupation resumes quickly under new rulers. The material record suggests a world accustomed to siege warfare, not shocked by it, but integrated with it. Cities expected to be tested. They prepared spiritually, economically, and architecturally. Siege warfare here was not an aberration. It was a climate condition of urban life, the balance of fear and necessity. In Egypt, the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean siege warfare lived in tension with something fragile connection. Cities needed walls to survive, but they also needed openness to trade, to pilgrimage, to diplomacy. Too much closure, and they strangled themselves. Too much openness, and they invited conquest. The siege forced this contradiction into the open. It asked each city the same question. What are you willing to sacrifice to endure grain autonomy, ritual purity, alliances, identity? The answers shaped not only outcomes of wars, but the cultural memory of entire peoples. A soft horizon. As evening settles over the harbor, lamps flicker along the walls. The sea darkens. Somewhere beyond sight, ships wait. Inland fires glow in a besieging camp, reflected faintly on stone. The city stands, for now, balanced between land and water gods and grain isolation and exchange. In the next part, we will step back into the scale of empire once more, following how a vast and diverse realm learned to take cities not only by force, but by administration roads and negotiation, where siege warfare became a tool of governance as much as conquest. Persia and the art of taking, the un-takeable. There is a different sound that announces a Persian siege. It is not the crash of impact or the roar of flame. It is the steady movement of people and provisions wagons creaking on packed earth hooves, striking a measured pace, voices speaking many languages under a single command. Long before a wall is tested, the ground around it begins to change. This part is about governance, as pressure about how the Persian world, vast and varied, approached siege warfare not as a single dramatic act, but as a calibrated choice among many tools. In the Achaemenid age, cities fell as often to promises, logistics, and inevitability as to rams and towers. The siege became something quieter, broader, and in many cases more effective, an empire that could wait. The Achaemenid Empire was built on distance. From the Aegean coast to the Iranian plateau and beyond it encompassed mountains, deserts, river valleys, ports, and fortified cities of every tradition. No single siege method could fit them all. Instead, Persian power rested on an ability to sustain presence, to move men and supplies reliably across long spaces, and to keep them there. This capacity reshaped siege warfare. Where earlier empires sought swift, decisive reduction of cities, the Persians could afford patience. Roads knit the empire together. Storehouses and relay stations supported armies in the field. Administrators tracked resources and obligations. A besieged city did not face an isolated host that might dissolve with the seasons. It faced the shadow of an empire that could remain. The implication was clear. Resistance might be heroic, but it would likely be temporary. The choice. Before the wall, Persian commanders often approached cities with an offer before a threat. Submit and retain your customs, your temples, your local leaders under tribute and imperial oversight. Resist, and the full machinery of siege would follow. This was not benevolence alone. It was efficiency. Cities that surrendered intact were immediately useful, tax-paying, road-guarding, provisioning nodes within a larger system. This choice mattered deeply in regions accustomed to siege trauma. Many cities had learned through Assyrian example the cost of defiance. Persian policy offered an alternative continuity with conditions. Thus, many sieges ended before they truly began, not because walls were weak, but because calculation favored survival. Logistics as siegecraft. When resistance did occur, Persian siege warfare revealed its true strength: logistics as a weapon. Armies were supplied along prepared routes. Grain, fodder, and equipment moved predictably. Garrisons secured surrounding territories, isolating cities not only physically, but administratively. Trade slowed. Allies hesitated. Messages took longer to pass. A city could look out from its walls and see no immediate assault and still feel the siege tightening. This approach blurred the line between blockade and governance. By controlling the systems that made urban life viable, roads, markets, tax flows, the Persians could apply pressure without spectacle. Hunger, when it came, felt less like a sudden catastrophe and more like a creeping certainty. Engineering without display. Persian armies possessed siege engines and engineers, but they often used them selectively. Why invest months in building towers if surrender could be negotiated? Why burn a city that would soon be needed to administer a province? Force was always available, but it was rarely the first choice. This restraint did not reflect weakness. It reflected confidence. When engines were deployed, they appeared as part of a larger orchestration, digging, battering, and intimidation, combined with diplomacy. The message was consistent. Resistance was costly and unnecessary. Cities understood that the empire did not need to prove its power loudly. Its power was already visible in the roads, the diversity of its troops, the administrative order that followed conquest. The moral geography of siege Persian rulers cultivated an image of just authority. This mattered in siege warfare. Preserving temples and local customs reduced rebellion. Allowing cities to keep their walls under garrison and tribute maintained stability. Siege warfare thus became a means of integration, not erasure. But this moral geography had boundaries. Cities that defied authority repeatedly or threatened strategic corridors could still face destruction or deportation. The difference lay in choice. The empire framed the siege as the defender's decision, not the attacker's impulse. This framing reshaped how siege warfare was remembered. Conquest could be narrated as restoration of order rather than conquest by terror. Archaeology of continuity. Material evidence supports this pattern. Many cities incorporated into the Persian realm show limited destruction layers. Urban life continues with adjustments, new administrative buildings, changes in taxation records, mixed material culture reflecting imperial presence. Fortifications remain sometimes even improved, now serving the empire rather than resisting it. Where destruction appears, it often aligns with strategic necessity rather than blanket policy. The siege in Persian hands becomes less about spectacle and more about absorption. Why this mattered Persian siegecraft demonstrated a crucial principle. Walls are only one layer of defense. A city depends on networks, political, economic, cultural. By controlling those networks, an empire can render walls psychologically obsolete long before they fall. Siege warfare, therefore, does not always culminate in breach. Sometimes it culminates in paperwork, oaths, and garrisons. This approach influenced later imperial thinking profoundly. It showed that the most effective siege might be the one that never fully unfolds. A gentle pause. As night settles, the city's lamps still burn. No towers advance, no rams strike. Yet outside the walls, the imperial camp remains orderly, supplied, patient. The city's leaders meet. Calculations are made. The walls stand, but their meaning has changed. In the next part, we will move into a world where citizen armies, limited campaigning seasons, and ideals of autonomy collide with the realities of fortified cities. We will see how the Greek world struggled, adapted, and ultimately transformed siege warfare in its own image. Greece, when citizen armies meet city walls. At first light, the fields outside the city are quiet. The hoplites stand in ordered ranks, shields resting against their legs, helmets catching a pale gleam. They have come expecting a battle, a single decisive collision of men. Instead, they face stone. The gates are shut, the walls are silent. This part is about collision not of armies, but of ideas. In the Greek world, siege warfare confronted a culture shaped by citizen soldiers, seasonal campaigning, and ideals of autonomy. For generations, Greek warfare imagined decision in open fields. Walls complicated that imagination. Slowly, painfully, the Greeks learned that cities would not always come out to fight, and that patience, engineering, and money could decide what courage alone could not. A world built for short wars. Classical Greek warfare grew from a particular social soil. City-states relied on citizens who were farmers, craftsmen, and householders. They could not stay in the field indefinitely. Crops needed tending, families needed care. War, therefore, tended to be brief and seasonal. Armies met, fought, and returned home. Victory was public and immediate. Defeat was limited. This tradition favored the pitched battle. Walls existed, of course, many Greek cities were fortified, but the expectation lingered that disputes would be resolved outside them. To remain behind walls could be seen as cowardly, even dishonorable. A city that refused battle risked its reputation. But reputations do not stop arrows. As rivalries intensified and stakes rose over trade routes, colonies, alliances, cities began to realize that walls were not signs of weakness. They were insurance. And once one city embraced fortification as strategy, others were forced to respond. The logic of the siege crept in. The awkward fit of early Greek sieges. Early Greek attempts at siege warfare were often hesitant and inefficient. Without standing armies or long-term logistical systems, many polis struggled to sustain blockades. Hoplites were not engineers by training. Equipment was limited. Money, always scarce, determined how long an army could remain in the field. As a result, early sieges tended to rely on pressure rather than breach-cutting fields, threatening raids, waiting for negotiation. Cities often held out until the attackers grew impatient or the campaigning season ended. This imbalance favored defenders. A city with walls, stores, and allies could often outlast a citizen army constrained by calendars and obligations. Siege warfare exposed the limits of traditional Greek military culture, and slowly adaptation followed. Walls and the politics of autonomy. Greek city-states were intensely sensitive to independence. A wall was not just a defense, it was a statement of sovereignty. To besiege a city was to challenge its right to decide its own fate. This political weight made sieges emotionally charged. Resistance became a test of identity. Cities invoked their gods, their founders, their ancestral laws. The longer a siege lasted, the more it hardened communal resolve, at least at first. Rituals multiplied. Public oaths were renewed. The wall became a sacred boundary, not merely a military one, but identity could also fracture. As pressure mounted, factions within cities debated whether autonomy was worth starvation. Siege warfare forced political questions into the open. who speaks for the city, who bears the cost of resistance, whose vision of honor prevails. In this sense, Greek sieges were as much internal struggles as external ones. Money enters the war. The decisive shift came with monetization. As coinage spread and economies grew more interconnected, some Greek states gained the ability to hire specialists, pay troops longer, and fund engineering projects. Siege warfare, once clumsy, became feasible. This transformation is visible most clearly in the great rivalries of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, where prolonged conflicts demanded new approaches. Walls were no longer just shelters. They were strategic assets integrated into long wars. Sieges became longer, more methodical, and more frequent. Citizen soldiers gave way in part to mercenaries and professionals who could stay in the field. Engineers, once rare, became valued. The cultural resistance to siege warfare did not vanish, but it bent under necessity, the city as battlefield. As siege warfare took root, the Greek city itself became the battlefield. Suburbs were fortified or abandoned. Long walls connected cities to ports, ensuring supply by sea, even when land routes were cut. Harbors became as vital as gates. Control of the countryside mattered less if grain could arrive by ship. This integration of fortification and strategy reshaped urban space. Cities like Athens demonstrated this vividly, binding urban life, naval power, and fortifications into a single system. A city under siege was no longer simply enclosed. It was reoriented toward the sea, toward allies, toward endurance. Opponents responded in kind. Siege warfare escalated not because of cultural preference, but because alternatives disappeared, learning the hard lessons. Greek literature and history preserve the emotional imprint of these changes. Sieges are described not only as military events, but as moral crises, times when laws were tested, traditions strained, and communities forced to confront their limits. Hunger, fear, and debate become characters in the story. Over time, Greek commanders learned that walls could not be ignored. They learned to combine blockade with negotiation, assault with diplomacy. They learned, sometimes painfully, that refusing to adapt meant losing cities without ever fighting a proper battle. By the late classical period, siege warfare was no longer foreign. It was an accepted, if still uneasy, part of Greek war-making. A threshold reached. As the sun sets behind the walls, torches flare along the parapets. The hoplites remain outside, no longer expecting a sudden clash. They know now that the war will be decided by days and weeks, by supplies and silver, by patience as much as valor. The Greek world has crossed a threshold. In the next part, that threshold will be shattered entirely. We will follow a conqueror who refused to wait, who fused Greek ingenuity with imperial scale, and in doing so transformed siege warfare into a science that would echo for centuries. Alexander's storm and the birth of Hellenistic siege science. When the storm comes, it does not ask permission of the shore. The sea darkens, wind sharpens, waves lift and strike the rocks with a force that feels deliberate. On the coastline, a city watches from behind its walls, confident in stone, confident in water, confident that distance itself is a defense. Beyond the surf, an army gathers timber, stone, and resolve. The horizon no longer promises patience, it promises impact. This part is about acceleration, about how siege warfare, long practiced and slowly refined, suddenly surged forward under the pressure of one man's refusal to accept limits. In the campaigns of Alexander, the great siege warfare ceased to be merely a means to an end. It became a proving ground for innovation, coordination, and audacity. And in its wake, a new world of military science emerged. Refusing the wall, Alexander inherited the lessons of Greece and Persia alike. From the Greeks, he absorbed the hard truth that walls could stall even the bravest army. From Persia, he learned that logistics, administration, and patience could win cities without slaughter. But Alexander added something volatile to this inheritance urgency. He did not want to wait for cities to decide their fate. He wanted momentum, psychological, political, and strategic. Every city that resisted threatened to slow the campaign, to invite rebellion behind him, to fracture the narrative of inevitability that sustained his advance. So Alexander treated sieges as crucibles. Each one would demonstrate that resistance was not merely futile, but creatively futile, that no configuration of wall water or will could not be answered. The sea denied Tyre nowhere. Was this philosophy tested more starkly than at Tyre? Tyre sat offshore, its walls rising directly from the sea, supplied by ships, confident in geography. Traditional siegecraft faltered here. There was no approach for rams, no soil for ramps. The city relied on water as its moat and commerce as its lifeline. Alexander answered with audacity. He ordered a causeway built from the mainland to the island, an act that was as symbolic as it was practical. Stone, timber, and rubble were carried forward into the waves day after day under missile fire. What had been sea became road. What had been distance became contact. Defenders countered with fire ships and attacks. Alexander responded with towers mounted on the growing causeway, with artillery that dominated the walls, with naval coordination that closed the harbor itself. The siege became a total system, land-sea engineering and morale fused into a single effort. When Tyre fell, the message traveled faster than any courier. No city was unreachable. Geography itself could be rewritten. Speed and severity. Alexander's sieges were not uniformly merciless, but they were decisive. Cities that surrendered early were often spared. Cities that resisted stubbornly and threatened the tempo of the campaign faced harsh consequences. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was signaling. Alexander needed the world to understand that delay had a cost. At Gaza, resistance met persistence. Strong walls, deep defenses, and determined leadership forced Alexander into a prolonged effort. When the city finally fell, the severity of punishment echoed through the region. The lesson was reinforced. Walls could buy time, but time itself was no longer neutral. Engineering as an extension of will. What distinguishes Alexander's sieges is not just innovation, but integration. Siege engines were no longer isolated tools. They were part of a choreography. Artillery suppressed defenders while engineers advanced. Naval forces cut supply while land forces built approaches. Specialists coordinated with infantry, cavalry, and command in real time. This integration demanded planning and communication at a level rarely seen before. Alexander surrounded himself with capable engineers and trusted them. He allowed technical solutions to shape strategy rather than forcing strategy to ignore reality. In doing so, he elevated siegecraft from a supporting skill to a central arm of warfare. The city became a problem to be solved holistically. The birth of a science after Alexander's siege warfare did not retreat. It crystallized. His successors, the rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms, governed a fragmented world of fortified cities, rival capitals, and strategic ports. They inherited Alexander's ambition without his singular authority, and so they compensated with technique. Libraries collected treatises. Engineers became court figures. Siege machines were standardized, refined, improved. Torsion artillery grew more powerful. Towers became taller and more stable. Countermeasures multiplied. Siege warfare became teachable. This is the true legacy of Alexander's storms, not just cities taken, but methods normalized. What had once been exceptional became expected. A city that built walls now assumed those walls would be tested by engineers who had studied how to break them. The city reimagined urban architecture responded. Walls thickened and angled. Towers projected outward. Gatehouses became killing zones. Cities were no longer built merely to be lived in. They were built to be contested. The siege was anticipated in stone and street layout. At the same time, rulers understood that cities were too valuable to destroy casually. Siege warfare balanced on a knife edge between annihilation and inheritance. Alexander had shown that speed could win empires, but governance required cities to remain functional. This tension defined the Hellenistic age. A quiet, after the thunder. When the dust settles, the causeway remains. The walls are repaired or rebuilt. Life resumes altered but continuous. Siege warfare has passed through the city like a storm, reshaping the landscape and the memory of resistance. The world that follows Alexander is louder, more technical, more calculated. Cities expect to be besieged by science, not chance. Engineers carry prestige. Mathematics hums beneath the violence. In the next part, we will listen closely to a new sound, the snap of twisted sinew, the whistle of flying stone, and explore how artillery transformed fear distance and the very psychology of walls. Torsion and thunder catapults towers, and the mathematics of fear. Before the stone is seen, it is heard. A low creak tightening. A brief pause as if the air itself is holding its breath. Then the crack of release, sharp and sudden, followed by a rushing whistle that grows louder with terrifying speed. The impact comes a heartbeat later, a thunderous strike against masonry dust, bursting outward like breath from a wounded wall. This is the sound that changes how cities think. This part is about distance mastered, about how siege warfare learned to strike from afar with accuracy, rhythm, and repetition. With the rise of torsion artillery in the Hellenistic world, fear itself became measurable. Walls were no longer safe simply because they were high. Defenders were no longer protected simply because they stood behind stone. Mathematics had entered the siege, and it did not bargain. The principle of torsion. Earlier siege engines relied on mass and momentum. Torsion artillery relied on stored force. At the heart of these machines were bundles of twisted sinew hair or rope, tightly wound to store energy. When released, that energy hurled bolts or stones with a power and consistency that shocked contemporaries. These were not crude contraptions. They were tuned instruments. The thickness of the skeins, the length of the arms, the weight of the projectile, all were calculated. For the first time, siege warfare could be standardized. An engine built in one city could be replicated in another. A projectile of known weight could be expected to travel a known distance. Walls could be tested, measured, and adjusted for on both sides. War had acquired a formula, a new soundscape of war. The psychological impact was immediate. Artillery changed the atmosphere of a siege. Instead of waiting in tense quiet or responding to close assaults, defenders now lived under intermittent, unpredictable bombardment. Stones fell without warning. Bolts punched through shields, doors, and bodies alike. Parapets that once felt secure became exposed platforms. Defenders could no longer simply watch. They had to hide. This shifted behavior on the walls. Guards rotated more frequently. Protective screens were erected. Movement became cautious. Morale suffered not because of immediate casualties alone, but because of constant threat. Even when no stones flew, the possibility hung in the air. The besieger, meanwhile, gained a new confidence. Distance reduced risk. Pressure could be applied day after day without immediate engagement. Artillery did not replace other methods, but it amplified them. Towers reborn. Siege towers evolved alongside artillery. No longer just platforms for archers, towers became mobile fortresses, armored, multi-tiered, and coordinated with bombardment. Artillery cleared parapets. Towers advanced. Bridges dropped. The sequence was deliberate. These machines demanded extraordinary resources. Timber iron fittings hides labor. Their construction was itself a declaration: this siege will be finished one way or another. Defenders responded by building counter-towers, thickening walls, and attempting to destroy engines with fire or sortie. But artillery made this increasingly dangerous. To approach the attacker's works was to enter a killing zone, measured and rehearsed. Mathematics becomes authority. What is striking about this period is how openly calculation guided decisions. Engineers adjusted torsion by counting turns. They tested shots. They recorded results. Over time, empirical knowledge accumulated. Manuals circulated. Apprentices learned from masters. Siege warfare became a profession. This professionalization shifted authority within armies. Commanders who understood or trusted engineers held an advantage. Cities that invested in technical knowledge endured longer. Those that relied on tradition alone found themselves outmatched by machines that did not respect custom or courage. The wall, once a symbol of permanence, became a variable. Cities under the equation. Urban design changed again. Walls thickened and angled to absorb impact. Towers were reshaped to minimize exposed surfaces. Streets near walls were widened or cleared to prevent collapse from cascading inward. Stone selection mattered. Mortar quality mattered. Cities like Rhodes became famous not only for their beauty, but for their defensive ingenuity, absorbing lessons from repeated sieges and refining counter-artillery measures. In such places, the wall became a textbook written in stone, yet no design was final. Each innovation provoked another. The mathematics of fear cut both ways. The moral distance widens artillery, increased emotional distance between attacker and defender. A stone does not know whom it kills. A bolt does not hear prayers. This distance made it easier to sustain violence over time. It also made outcomes feel impersonal, less like clashes of will, more like mechanical processes. For rulers, this was useful. Sieges could be justified as technical necessities rather than acts of vengeance. Destruction became a byproduct of calculation. Responsibility blurred. And for the besieged, the experience was disorienting. Death arrived without confrontation. The wall no longer mediated violence. It attracted it. Archaeology of impact. Modern excavations bear this out. Stone shot is found in clusters. Bolt heads appear embedded deep in masonry. Repairs show sudden reinforcements at specific heights, responses to known artillery ranges. Entire neighborhoods near walls show patterns of collapse consistent with bombardment rather than assault. These are not stories preserved in song. They are equations preserved in rubble. The new normal. By the late Hellenistic age, a city that could not withstand artillery was not considered secure. Siege warfare had entered a phase of expectation. Rulers planned for it. Cities budgeted for it. Engineers trained for it. The thunder of torsion engines became part of the ancient world's background noise, a reminder that distance no longer guaranteed safety, and that knowledge could strike as hard as iron. As the echoes fade, another transformation is already underway. In the next part, we will follow a power that absorbed these lessons and applied them with relentless discipline, turning siege warfare into a routine of governance where camps, ditches, and patience mattered as much as machines. Rome disciplined roads and the siege as administration. Before the first stone is thrown, the ground is already changing. At dawn, a line of men advances in silence, each knowing his task. Picks bite into earth. Ditches deepen with steady rhythm. Wooden stakes rise measured and aligned. By midday, a camp has taken shape, rectangular, orderly, familiar. Roads connect it to supply columns that arrive with the reliability of tides. Around a distant city, the landscape itself is reorganized, not in haste, but in confidence. This part is about order as a weapon, about how Roman siege warfare transformed the act of surrounding a city into a form of administration. Where others relied on terror, ingenuity, or audacity, Rome relied on something quieter and more durable, discipline, repetition, and systems that turned time into certainty. The Roman way of staying Roman power grew along roads. Those roads carried legions, grain, timber, iron, and information. They allowed armies to appear where expected and to remain where needed. This logistical backbone changed siege warfare fundamentally. A Roman army did not merely arrive at a city, it settled in. The Roman camp was a tool of siegecraft in itself. Its layout was standardized, defensible, and efficient. Even under threat, soldiers slept behind ditches and palisades protected by routines honed through training. This stability mattered. Sieges were exhausting. Rome made endurance ordinary. In contrast to citizen militias bound by seasons, Roman forces, especially in the late Republic and early Empire, were professional. They could stay, they could build, they could wait. And waiting done properly was victory. Encirclement as bureaucracy. Roman sieges often began not with assault, but with containment. Lines were drawn, roads cut, fields seized, river crossings controlled. The city was not attacked everywhere at once. It was managed. Patrols rotated. Watch schedules were enforced. Supply depots were established. Engineers surveyed walls while soldiers dug. This methodical approach blurred the boundary between war and governance. The besieged city became a temporary administrative district, isolated, monitored, and processed. When the Romans built circumvallation rings of fortification facing inward, they turned the city into a controlled space. When they added contravallation outer rings facing outward, they protected the siege from relief forces. The city was enclosed within an equation of earth and wood, engineering without drama. Roman siege engines existed, rams, towers, artillery, but they were often deployed late. Why rush if starvation would suffice? Why risk casualties if discipline could do the work? Roman commanders preferred inevitability to spectacle. They gathered intelligence. They measured supplies. They counted days. Assault came when the outcome was already decided or when speed mattered more than preservation. This restraint reflected Roman priorities. Cities were assets. Their populations paid taxes, produced recruits, and sustained trade. To destroy a city unnecessarily was to damage Rome's future revenue. Thus, Roman siege warfare often sought control over annihilation, law, punishment, and example. When Rome did act decisively, it acted to teach. Cities that resisted beyond reason or threatened broader stability might face severe consequences, enslavement, destruction, or public punishment. These acts were calculated, not impulsive. They served as warnings that traveled along the same roads as legions and merchants. Yet just as often Rome rewarded submission. Cities that opened gates early might retain local institutions, temples, and elites under Roman oversight. Siege warfare thus became a tool for sorting loyalty, not merely crushing opposition. This combination of mercy and severity gave Roman power a chilling clarity. Archaeology of routine excavations across former Roman frontiers reveal the consistency of this approach. Siege camps show identical layouts hundreds of miles apart. Ditches and ramparts follow familiar proportions. Roads converge on besieged sites. Supply depots cluster nearby. The material record speaks of repetition of a system refined through decades of application. Cities taken by Rome often show continuity beneath new administration. Walls repaired, streets reused, temples maintained. The siege was a phase, not an end, the human experience inside the ring. For defenders, Roman sieges were uniquely demoralizing. The enemy did not shout. They did not rush. They worked. Day after day the ring tightened. No dramatic assault to repel, no decisive moment to rally around, just the slow realization that time favored the besieger. This quiet pressure eroded morale more effectively than thunder. Hunger came, disease followed, factions argued, hope narrowed. Rome understood the psychology well. Its commanders allowed the city to exhaust itself. Why Rome changed siege warfare? Rome did not invent new machines so much as it perfected processes. By integrating roads, camps, logistics, discipline, and law, it made siege warfare predictable. Cities could anticipate what resistance would cost, and many chose not to pay it. This predictability allowed Rome to govern a vast urbanized world. Siege warfare became an administrative extension of imperial order. The fading echo. As the gates finally open, there is no chaos. Roman standards enter, registers are drawn, garrisons take positions. Life resumes under new rules. The wall remains, but it belongs to Rome now. In the next part, we will step beyond the Mediterranean heartland into other ancient worlds, where siege warfare evolved along different lines, shaped by distinct landscapes, philosophies, and technologies, yet driven by the same pressures of urban life and power. Beyond the Mediterranean, India, China, and the wider ancient world of fortification night settles over a city far from the Aegean. The air is heavy with incense and river mist. On the walls, lanterns burn behind screens of lacquered wood. Below the ground is marked with straight lines and measured pits, earthworks laid out with quiet precision. Somewhere a bell sounds to mark the watch. The siege here does not announce itself with spectacle. It unfolds as order applied to space. This part is about parallel invention, about how siege warfare emerged wherever cities concentrated people, power, and surplus, even when cultures shared no contact. In South and East Asia, fortification and siegecraft developed along distinctive paths shaped by environment philosophy and state formation. The result was not a single tradition copied from elsewhere, but multiple answers to the same ancient question: how do you take a city without destroying the world that depends on it? India, cities, monsoons, and the politics of restraint. In the Indian subcontinent, siege warfare grew within landscapes governed by seasonality. Monsoon rains transformed roads into rivers and fields into marsh. Heat and disease could cripple armies as surely as arrows. Cities adapted by integrating fortification with water management moats, reservoirs, and controlled approaches that doubled as civic infrastructure. To besiege such a city was to contend not only with walls but with climate. Texts associated with statecraft emphasize calculation over fury. Siege warfare is presented as one option among many used when diplomacy fails and rebellion threatens stability. Attackers are urged to isolate cities, disrupt supply, and pressure leadership rather than rush walls. The aim is continuity to inherit a functioning city capable of taxation and order once resistance ends. Large states such as those associated with the Maurya Empire could afford patience. Roads and administrative networks allowed them to sustain pressure. Cities that surrendered were absorbed. Those that resisted faced removal of elites or garrisons imposed to prevent future revolt. Siegecraft here reflects a political philosophy, wary of needless devastation in a densely populated, interconnected landscape. Earth, not stone materials, and method. Across much of South Asia, earthwork fortifications dominated. Rammed earth timber palisades and deep moats absorbed impact differently than stone. They could be repaired quickly, they resisted fire better than expected, and when breached, they often slumped rather than shattered, changing the nature of assault. Attackers responded with ramps, trenches, and flooding strategies. Control of water diverting channels, breaching embankments became a powerful tool. Siege warfare thus blended civil engineering with military intent, blurring the line between destruction and redirection. The wall was not merely an obstacle, it was part of a hydraulic system, and that system could be turned against itself. China walls as moral architecture. In early China, siege warfare evolved alongside a profound rethinking of the state. During periods of intense rivalry, such as those associated with the warring state cities, multiplied walls thickened and warfare became systemic. Fortifications were massive, layered, and geometrically planned. Moats widened, gates narrowed, towers projected cover approaches. But the Chinese approach to siege warfare carried a distinctive moral framing. Texts and traditions emphasized order, hierarchy, and legitimacy. A city's fall was not merely a military event. It was a judgment on governance. Siege warfare sought to demonstrate that resistance to rightful authority led to isolation, hunger, and collapse, not through chaos, but through inevitability. Thus, siegecraft favored encirclement, deprivation, and psychological pressure. Assault was possible, but often delayed until moral authority had been asserted through patience and control. Engineering at scale Chinese states invested heavily in standardization. Measurements were unified. Labor was organized through corvée systems. Materials were sourced and moved with bureaucratic efficiency. Earthworks rose quickly, shaped by experience and recorded practice. The besieging army became a mirror of the state, ordered, disciplined, and relentless. Defenders responded in kind. Counter-tunnels, layered walls, and internal redoubts created depth. Cities were designed to fail slowly, buying time for relief or negotiation. The siege became a contest not only of strength, but of administrative endurance. This symmetry, state against state, pushed siege warfare toward unprecedented scale. Beyond the great centers, convergent solutions. Across Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, and regions beyond the Mediterranean orbit, similar pressures produced familiar answers. Where trade routes converged, cities fortified. Where power centralized, siegecraft followed. Timber towers appear in different guises. Ramps and mining recur. Moats widen. Gates become labyrinths. Even without shared blueprints, human societies repeatedly arrived at comparable solutions because the problem was the same. Urban life concentrates value. Concentrated value attracts force. Force, over time, becomes technique. Archaeology of many traditions. The ground preserves these convergences. Excavations reveal earthworks shaped by careful compaction, moats aligned with seasonal water flow, repeated repair phases indicating expected sieges. Cities show layered defenses, outer works sacrificed to protect inner cores. In some places, destruction is rare. In others, it is cyclical. The material record suggests that siege warfare was anticipated, budgeted for, and culturally integrated. This anticipation matters. It tells us that siege warfare was not a crisis response. It was a planning assumption. Why these worlds matter to the story. By stepping beyond the Mediterranean, we see the deeper truth. Siege warfare is not a cultural accident. It is a structural response to urbanization and state power. Different civilizations emphasized different tools: climate management, earthworks, moral authority, bureaucracy. But the logic remained consistent. Cities gathered life. Siege warfare tested whether that life could be defended or reclaimed without tearing society apart. The quiet before the end. As the watch bell sounds again, the city holds. The ring tightens. Somewhere administrators tally grain, engineers measure earth, envoys weigh words. The siege proceeds not as frenzy, but as process. In the final part, we will return to the breach and the silence that follows. We will ask what siege warfare ultimately meant for the ancient world, and why after millennia it remains inseparable from the story of civilization itself. The quiet after the breach. Why sieges defined antiquity. There is a moment after the noise ends when the city seems to listen to itself. Dust drifts through broken light. A gate hangs open on shattered hinges. Somewhere a dog barks, once, then stops. The shouts have moved inward now, away from the walls, echoing down streets that were once familiar. For those who survived, the silence that follows is heavier than the thunder that came before. This final part is about aftermath and meaning, about what siege warfare ultimately did to the ancient world, and why it became one of the most defining experiences of civilization itself. The breach was never the end of the story, it was the beginning of a reckoning. What fell with the wall? When a city fell, more than stone collapsed. Walls protected archives, granaries, temples, workshops, and families. Their failure exposed everything beneath. Sometimes the outcome was slaughter and enslavement. Sometimes negotiation preserved lives but reordered power. In every case, siege warfare forced a total confrontation between conqueror and community. This totality is what made sieges so decisive. A defeated field army could regroup. A burned village could be rebuilt. But a fallen city, especially a capital, often meant the unraveling of administration, identity, and legitimacy. Kings fled or were captured. Gods were carried off or reinstalled. Records changed hands. The conqueror did not simply defeat an enemy, he inherited a system. That inheritance shaped ancient politics. To rule meant to rule cities. To rule cities meant to master sieges. Mercy, memory, and control. Ancient sieges varied wildly in outcome, but patterns emerge. Some conquerors practiced restraint, preserving populations and institutions to ensure revenue and stability. Others chose terror, believing that fear saved time in the long run. Both approaches relied on memory. Cities remembered what happened to others. Stories traveled faster than armies. Siege warfare thus created a geography of expectation. Communities weighed resistance against precedent. Leaders calculated the cost of defiance. Even the strongest walls could not fully protect against reputation. In this way, siege warfare extended beyond the battlefield into diplomacy, psychology, and long-term governance. The human cost measured. In generations, for ordinary people, sieges were among the most traumatic events imaginable. Hunger reshaped bodies. Disease spread in crowded quarters. Families were separated by death, enslavement, or deportation. Even when a city survived, the experience lingered, embedded in ritual, law, and memory. Archaeology bears this out. We find sudden demographic shifts, changes in diet, alterations in burial practice, rebuilt neighborhoods with different layouts. The siege left marks that lasted longer than the walls themselves. And yet, people returned. Cities were rebuilt, markets reopened. Children were born into streets repaired over rubble. Siege warfare was devastating, but it was not annihilating. Civilization absorbed it, adapted to it, and continued. Why siege warfare endured. Across millennia, siege warfare persisted because it addressed a fundamental tension of urban life. Cities concentrate wealth, authority, and culture. That concentration creates vulnerability. Siege warfare emerged as the most reliable way to exploit or defend that vulnerability. It scaled with society. As cities grew richer, sieges grew more complex. As states grew larger, sieges became more administrative, more scientific, more predictable. Siege warfare rewarded organization over impulse patience, over rage systems, over heroics. It favored those who could plan supply and endure. In doing so, it mirrored the very qualities that made civilizations powerful. This is why siege warfare appears again and again in different forms across unrelated cultures. It is not an anomaly. It is a consequence. The wall as mirror. In the end, the wall tells us who a society is. Its height reflects fear. Its thickness reflects memory. Its design reflects lessons learned sometimes painfully over generations. And the methods used to break it reveal equally much about the attacker, their resources, their values, their vision of the future. Siege warfare is where civilization confronts itself. It asks whether order can survive violence, whether continuity can follow conquest, whether power can be transferred without erasing the past. Sometimes the answer was no. Often it was imperfect, but the attempt shaped the ancient world more deeply than any single battle. The quiet that remains. As rebuilding begins, the breach is closed not with the same stones, but with new ones. Mortar is mixed, timber is raised. The scar remains, but it becomes part of the wall's story. The city lives on. And so does siege warfare, not as noise and flame, but as memory, planning, and caution embedded in urban life. Every gate is watched. Every wall is measured. Every city knows somewhere in its foundations that it may one day be tested. That knowledge, quiet, enduring, is the final legacy of siege warfare in ancient times.